U.S. President Biden today called on his fellow Americans to defend democracy from threats at home and abroad. And he did that with one eye to what happened 80 years ago this week. Biden spoke at Pointe-du-Hoc in France, where American soldiers fought a pivotal battle during the D-Day invasion 80 years ago. Biden's speech follows a pledge of support for Ukraine in its war against Russia, and it comes during a divisive election race with his Republican rival, former U.S. President Donald Trump. Here's more of what the U.S. president said today in France.
As we gather here today, it's not just to honor those who showed such remarkable bravery on that day, June 6, 1944. It's to listen to the echoes of their voices, to hear them, because they are summoning us, and they're summoning us now. They ask us, what will we do? They're not asking us to scale these cliffs, but they're asking us to stay true to what America stands for. They're not asking us to give or risk our lives, but they are asking us to care for others in our country more than ourselves. They're not asking us to do their job. They're asking us to do our job, to protect freedom in our time, to defend democracy, to stand up aggression abroad and at home, to be part of something bigger than ourselves.
That was the U.S. president there. I'm joined now by my colleague, William Bluecroft. He was listening and analyzing the words of the U.S. president. William, it's good to have you here. It was clear who he was talking about, but to whom was the U.S. president speaking?
I think he had two key audiences: Americans at home, his European allies on this side of the Atlantic, trying to remind Americans in an election year, obviously to vote for him, but from his perspective, to defend democracy. Because, of course, Joe Biden has basically pitched himself as the defender against the likes of Donald Trump for the American way of life. That's what he was talking about in his speech. He didn't outline it very specifically what exactly he was talking about, these big themes of democracy, freedom, liberal values. But then, of course, a skittish European public and European allies, European counterparts, trying to make the case that America's not going anywhere, that just as Americans stormed the beaches to free Europe 80 years ago, they will stand up in an equivalent, albeit different way today.
If there had not been a Donald Trump presidency, do you think this speech would have even been made today? I mean, Donald Trump and his legacy and what could possibly still come, that was the driving force behind all of this, wasn't it?
Sure, but it wasn't the first time a U.S. president came to such a momentous and historic location like the D-Day landings in northern France to make a grandiose speech about the importance of American democracy, of American power in the world. Almost every U.S. president has done it. D-Day and the World War II story, more broadly speaking, is such an easy story, as difficult as the war was, but it's such an easy black and white good versus evil story to drape upon more complicated present political issues that we have today. The problem is, yes, that is historically true, right? It really was good versus evil and the free world fighting against tyranny. But that was if not singular, a rare moment in global history. Yeah. You can't apply a rare moment to everything all the time.
Well, I was going to ask you, these comparisons that are implied, that were made in this speech, are they correct, or are we conflating conflicts here?
Well, of course, and let's not forget, even back then, the so-called free world also oversaw colonies around the world. They themselves picked and chose, just as we're picking and choosing today, who got to be free and who didn't get to be free, and who got to enjoy these values and who didn't. So there were discrepancies and double standards there then, and there are today. And it's very, very dangerous. There are, of course, always parallels. Of course, there are parallels. The full-scale war in Ukraine that Russia has launched is the largest land battle in Europe since World War II. There's no disputing that. But Russia is not Nazi Germany, and Vladimir Putin is not Adolf Hitler. So these parallels can only go so far. And it's a very difficult argument for Joe Biden to be making, to stand for something bigger than just yourself, to make a sacrifice, especially given America's flavor of liberal democracy, which is about yourself. It's about the individual. It's about doing what's best for you.
He was speaking also to America's allies, particularly the allies here in Europe, because there is this fear that the alliances that have made up our world order for the past 70 years, that they could soon fall away. And that's the point, isn't it? That here in Europe, leaders want the status quo to remain?
Yeah, well, it's very difficult. So you have, on one hand, criticism of American power, an interest not just from extreme sides of wanting to see America recede or wanting to see some kind of rebalance. Obviously, we hear from Emmanuel Macron first and foremost, but also the Zeitenwende here in Germany about Europe being more of an equal security partner with the United States. But on the other hand, what does that really mean? And you could be the most critical person of American power and the impact and the consequences that U.S. powers had in the world. But if that just went away tomorrow, there would be a massive vacuum, right? That could sow more chaos. Yeah. So it's not just, well, let's get rid of the last 80 years. Let's get rid of the Euro-Atlantic alliance. There needs to be a talk of, okay, well, what replaces that? What comes next? Otherwise, you're looking at a power vacuum, which could make things even more chaotic than they are today.
William Bluecroft, as always, William, it's good to see you. We appreciate your analysis. Thank you. Well, after meeting with Joe Biden earlier today, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is now holding talks with the French President Emmanuel Macron. Zelensky is at the D-Day commemorations to shore up support for Ukraine's war against Russia. France has now agreed to supply Mirage fighter jets and train Ukrainian pilots as part of a new military aid package. Earlier in the day, Zelensky gave an address to the French Parliament where he called for more efforts to achieve what he called a fair peace. All right, I want to pull in now Frank Ledwidge. He is a senior lecturer in strategic studies at Portsmouth University. He's a former UK military intelligence officer. He joins us tonight from Oxford. Frank, it's good to see you again. We understand that it could be months until Ukraine can actually use these jets on the battlefield, in the skies. Meanwhile, we're getting daily reports of Russia ramping up its attacks. I mean, will these fighter jets, will they be, too little, too late? I mean, is the timing here off?
Well, good evening, Brent. Yes, they're not going to be, we're not going to be seeing them in useful quantities, and they'll probably get around 25 from France eventually, well into next year. Even then, I would question whether the integration of this system, the Mirage 2000 system, which is a 1990s design, this particular variant they're getting, I'd question whether that would be complete even then. We're looking, I think, out a year. But it will provide a capability. Will it provide extra capability? Probably not. What it will provide is capacity, which is to say more jets. The problem is, though, it is an old jet. There are concerns about age. As with any military aircraft, the important element is what's in them, not what the airframe does. So that's the avionics. It's not clear yet what they will be supplied with. But yes, it's better than nothing. If I were the Ukrainians, however, I'd be looking at Swedish aircraft, much more suitable, much more up to date. The Swedes are keen to supply them eventually, rather than just multiplying the number of airframes and logistics chains.
Well, when you say sometime late next year, I mean, it sounds like you're expecting this war to last a lot longer than has been predicted. I mean, is that what we're seeing with these promises of Mirage fighter jets?
Well, I think Brent, this is positive. It's mainly a political gesture, I think. But what we're seeing now, and we haven't seen for the last 2 years, is a sense of a sustainment for the Ukrainian military. In other words, looking ahead more than next month or the next couple of months. What we need to be seeing is looking at 2, 5, 10 years to provide Ukraine not only with the ability to at least defend themselves now, but also to deter future aggression alongside its future NATO allies. So this is a long-term commitment, and I think it's right that it is. Whether the war will last that long, look, I don't have my crystal ball. Yeah. I don't know, and nor do you or anybody else.
That's correct. Let's look at the immediate future here. Ukraine has been given a green light by its allies to strike targets inside Russia with Western-supplied weapons. Does Ukraine need these jets, these Mirage fighter jets, to do exactly that?
This particular variant is multi-role. In theory, it can strike, or it's designed to strike behind enemy lines like most aircraft. The very similar F-16 is another one. I'd be doubtful, frankly, whether the avionics, the electronics, the radars, targeting systems would be able to penetrate the very formidable Russian ground-based air defense system. So I would suspect that aircraft of this age and capability would be used within the country to supplement air defences against cruise missile attack and drone attack, and of course against Russian aircraft should they be a threat themselves. I'd be doubtful about putting them into Russian airspace, or indeed the F-16s, frankly, and I would doubt whether that's going to be either airframe's primary role.
Russia's President Putin has warned that Russia could provide long-range weapons to some of its allies, to some countries, to strike Western targets in response to NATO allowing Ukraine to use Western weapons to attack Russian territory. I mean, is that a credible threat? And what countries is Putin talking about, do you think?
He's talking about Syria, Lebanon, Iran, conceivably some Caribbean countries, or to provide a capability to them. It is very credible, I think. Look, Putin's made threats now for the last 2 years. And the issue here is his credibility. And at some point, his bluff is going to be called. And this threat of proxy action is credible. It's quite dangerous. And of course, it's another ratchet up on the escalatory ladder that we've been seeing all the way really since the start of the war. So yes, it is credible and very dangerous, I suspect.
Frank Letwidge, as always, Frank, we appreciate your time and your analysis tonight. Thank you.
As Europe and the United States paid homage to those who defeated tyranny 80 years ago, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky pleaded with fellow leaders to help his country do the same now against Russia's illegal aggression, comparing Russian President Vladimir Putin's actions with Adolf Hitler's.
Very important that in this unity, United States, America, all American people stay with Ukraine, like it was during World War II.
President Biden apologized for the long delay in the last U.S. aid package and announced a new one worth $225 million. But all eyes were on the host, French President Emmanuel Macron, who for months has been considering whether to dispatch French troops to train Ukrainians inside Ukraine. It was speculated he would reveal a decision now, but he didn't, announcing instead an aid package, including the delivery of Mirage fighter jets and the training of pilots, plus an entire brigade of Ukrainian soldiers. But this will take place
en France.
In France, he said.
C'est une demande légitime.
Although it's a legitimate request to do it inside Ukraine, he added. Macron also rejected Moscow's claim that trainers inside Ukraine would represent direct French and therefore NATO participation in the war, an escalation. It's Putin who has escalated the war, Macron said.
Sur Vladimir Poutine.
But that's nonetheless a convenient Kremlin narrative NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg and other allied governments work constantly to rebuff.
NATO has no plans to deploy forces to Ukraine.
Finnish President Alexander Stubb says he won't be sending troops either and doesn't support the idea of acting alone.
I think it's very important that when we are part of the alliance, we work as an alliance and not in separate blocks.
More allied scrutiny of Macron's actions may be on the way with Paris's announcement it would be sending Mirage fighter jets, as the rest of NATO has agreed to focus on the delivery of F-16s. Ukrainian President Zelensky just said he's grateful for more support.
Well, our correspondent Terry Schultz, she filed that report. Terry joins me now from Brussels. Good evening to you, Terry. That was an excellent report. The comparison of Adolf Hitler with Vladimir Putin. That is a main takeaway from this week's D-Day commemorations, and it is not without controversy. Is this a comparison that is shared among all allies of Ukraine?
Well, it's very hard to say that anything is shared among all allies because, of course, you have countries like Hungary, which says it does not support Ukraine and that any help for Kyiv is prolonging the war, that anyone who sends assistance to Ukraine is a warmonger. That said, it was very helpful for President Zelensky that so many countries, that so many world leaders in their speeches did make this comparison, that you saw all the crosses, in those very touching scenes that showed that fighters from all over the world were willing to come the last time that tyranny threatened to overtake the European continent. And President Zelensky and other frontline states have long wanted, all of the allies to feel that this is their fight, that Ukraine's fight must be shared by all of these other countries in Europe. So I think that this touched a lot of hearts, and especially, for example, these scenes that we saw when the World War II veterans told President Zelensky that he's a hero because he's now fighting for Europe. And of course, President Zelensky turned it back on the veterans themselves.
Yeah, it was a moving moment from yesterday, that's for sure. What about the French Mirage fighter jets for Ukraine? Considering that these planes will not be in use until sometime next year, is this more of a political gesture and less of a move to help Ukraine's military?
Well, I think it can be both, Brent. And I'm certain that President Zelensky is thankful for any assistance he's getting. Remember when he used to say that he wanted fighter jets and they told him he was never getting them. So now he is. One of the problems inside NATO, though, and this is a bit complicated, is that most allies have decided that they should really focus on F-16s, that you should train pilots to fly one system and then work on getting supplies for those systems, work on getting, components that will be needed for repairs. And basically, for example, Sweden, which was willing to provide its own Gripen jets, was told to stand down. Let's all focus on F-16s. And then I can tell you that this came as a surprise to allies that French President Macron announced he's sending French Mirage jets. This was done not in consultation with other allies, from what I'm being told. And while, of course, no one's going to disparage contributions to Ukraine, this makes it a little complicated for the other allies. And when you mention a political gesture, France has come under a lot of criticism for the very low level of aid to Ukraine in comparison to GDP. It's like number 23 or something. You've got countries like even Belgium ahead of it, not to mention the Baltic states, which are pledging, above 1% of their own GDP. So I would say this could be both a political gesture and an attempt to help Ukraine.
Now, what about training Ukrainian pilots to fly these planes? Why does Ukraine want the trainers to be inside Ukraine?
Well, it's not just trainers for the jets. It's all kinds of training, from what I understand from Ukraine's request. And something very interesting that came out of an interview President Macron gave last night to French television. He said that President Zelensky had renewed this request to get trainers inside Ukraine just 48 hours ago, and that therefore he expects there to be more consideration of it. Now, what Ukraine is saying is that then it wouldn't have to take its soldiers so far from the front line, that you maybe go to Western Ukraine where it's safer, you do the training, where you're not putting the French or other forces in so much danger, and then they can go right back to the front line more quickly. But I've talked to a lot of other countries, and they say, look, the risk is just not worth it for us. You can hop them across the border quickly as well, and then you don't run the risk of, giving the Kremlin this very convenient narrative that NATO is taking part directly in the fight. Now, of course, Secretary General Stoltenberg will say if a country sends its trainers inside Ukraine, that's bilateral to Ukraine. It's not a NATO fight. But of course, that's not what the Kremlin says.
Terry, what do you make of the Kremlin's reaction? Vladimir Putin reportedly thinks that this proves that Emmanuel Macron really wants French or NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine.
But, Brent, this is what he would say no matter what. I mean, you and I have talked about this many times. He calls everything an escalation. The problem is that in this case, if you finally do openly have French or soldiers from other countries inside Ukraine announcing that they go inside Ukraine, it makes it a lot easier for Vladimir Putin to say now NATO is taking part. And before that, when troops are training Ukrainians outside Ukraine and giving assistance, even taking off the restrictions for the use of those weapons, it's a lot easier for NATO to say, hey, we're not on the ground there. This does complicate things for NATO.
DW's Terry Schultz tonight in Brussels. Terry, as always, thank you. Have a good weekend.